Tonight on Nation to Nation, the election campaign is on, but child welfare is absent as an issue. Cindy Blackstock wonders how the Trudeau government can ignore charges of being willful and reckless to Indigenous children.
And consciously discriminating against these children, and that resulted in child deaths and unnecessary family separations. You think at least he would say something about it, and there was silence.
Child welfare underfunding has put kids at risk. 102 Indigenous children have died in Ontario in 5 years, 72 in Northern Ontario.
We've demonstrated that children are dying. We can no longer continue to allow children to die simply because they have structural inequity in the North.
And 2 Indigenous Crown wards tell us what they think of Trudeau and Andrew Scheer's support to review a compensation order.
I want to tell them that they need to stop living up their asses.
Welcome to a new season of Nation to Nation. I'm your host, Todd Lamarand, and we're coming back right in the middle of an election campaign. The vote less than 2 weeks to go on October 21st. But one story hasn't been getting near enough attention: on-reserve child welfare. So we're dedicating our first show to this crisis. We all know Canada is guilty of deliberately underfunding on-reserve child welfare. And just last month, APTN put a death tally on it. Nation to Nation producer Kenneth Jackson spent 2 years investigating the system in Ontario and found 102 Indigenous children connected to child welfare had died over 5 years. Here's the opening from that exclusive story.
Every 3 days, a child connected to care dies.
It was somewhere around 9 in the morning, and all he said was, "The baby turned blue. We're on our way to the hospital."
Nothing the government can do can make up for the wrongs it consciously perpetrated against kids. And I want to emphasize that. It was conscious. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an accident.
As you just saw, our next guest had something to say about discriminatory practices and funding, and she's fought for over a decade to prove it. Cindy Blackstock is the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Welcome to Nation, Ms. Blackstock.
Thank you.
As I said in my opening remarks, and as people who are familiar with Ken's story, there's a shocking tally of deaths. Yeah. We looked at the funding data and showed that where most of these children died were 3 Indigenous agencies, and they were underfunded approximately $400 million. What do you think when you heard about that?
I thought about how preventable it was, to be honest, Todd. You know, I thought about how many of these children would have been alive had Canada addressed the funding inequalities in First Nations child welfare back in 2000, when we first identified it along with them in a report called the National Policy Review. These children, most of them weren't even born yet. Had those services been put in place, the prevention services, the culturally based services, I think many of those children would still be with us. It is the consequence of Canada's dramatic underfunding of child welfare, not just child welfare. We need to remember these same kids get less money for education. Some of them don't have clean water to drink. It just piles on all of these inequalities. And we know from the leading research around the world that when children are treated unequally, overrepresentation in juvenile justice, child welfare, mental health, poor health outcomes, and indeed death are predictable outcomes.
48 of these deaths happened between your historic victory at the Human Rights Tribunal and when Trudeau increased funding. So how accountable is he and the Liberal government?
I think that all of the politicians are accountable for this. They, when that decision came down in 2016, you'll remember that 2 ministers came out and welcomed the decision, and then he did nothing. And we knew that time when they're sitting there doing nothing meant that families were being separated unnecessarily and children were being put at risk of death. And by 2017, the tribunal, an independent judiciary body, links Canada's underfunding to the deaths of 2 children. No politician, Prime Minister, has ever acknowledged that. It didn't acknowledge it even in last month when the tribunal said again that Canada was willfully and recklessly and consciously discriminating against these children, and that resulted in child deaths and unnecessary family separations. You think at least he would say something about it, and there was silence.
Of course, when the tribunal ruled back in January of 2016, Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett got a current Liberal candidate, Cynthia Wesley Eskimo, to go across the country and create a report on how bad the problem was. What did you think when you saw the report she produced?
I thought that report was completely unnecessary. We already knew about the problem. The government likes to do that. They like to fund studies so it looks like they're doing something. Well, they were already ordered to do something, and that was to remedy these inequalities, make sure families had a fair chance at being able to raise their children in culturally based ways, and making sure that children in care had the supports they needed. That's what they were ordered to do. They weren't ordered to take up another study that was totally unnecessary.
Of course, Indigenous Affairs got split into two, and Jane Philpott came on as Indigenous Services Minister. And she was put in charge of the file. What did you think? Did you think there was going to be some sort of change at that point?
Well, I hope so, and I can just say that, I think the most positive change happened while she was minister of that department. But then when ministers change, progress slowed. And again, we're at a point where we're having to litigate against Canada. We're waiting for more orders, and there's more items to litigate because Canada refuses to sit down with us and resolve these things in favor of kids.
Of course, she convened an emergency meeting, Ms. Philpott did at the time, and I guess you could say that the end result was Bill C-92. But it was rushed. I don't believe it was put into force until actually the election was called, as I recall. What does this act need to succeed then?
Funding. There's no positive, clear obligation on behalf of the federal or provincial or territorial governments to fund First Nations laws. And one of the other important things that viewers may not know is that the federal government refuses to fund First Nations laws under the monies that are now allocated for First Nations agencies. We asked them to expand that definition because they were reviewing what they call their terms and authorities for that program just this last year. They refused. So there's no money under that Child and Family Services program for First Nations laws, and there's nothing that's clear in this Bill C-92. So what you could end up with is your own law and no money to operate it. And to me, that's a disgrace. It is a wrong interpretation of what the affirmation of First Nations jurisdiction should be.
You call it a disgrace. Do you think, looking back at it, without this commitment to funding, that the Liberal government was ever taking this issue seriously?
I don't know. I haven't. What I found is that they're most responsive to the legal orders. When we look at when things started to change with Jordan's principle, when things started they funded prevention at actuals, it was all in response to legal orders. It wasn't a kind of awakening within the department of, oh my gosh, these children and their families are suffering, let's do the right thing. It's always been because of legal orders.
As I mentioned off the top, we're in the middle of an election campaign right now. How surprised are you this hasn't become much of an election issue? It's been overshadowed by Trudeau wearing brownface or Andrew Scheer. We find out he's an American citizen.
Yeah, that terrifies me. I remember back 112 years ago, Todd, there was a Dr. Bryce, who blew the whistle on the needless deaths of children in residential school, and not just far from here. He walks into a publishing company with a document called A National Crime, where he details all the horrors are happening to kids and how he tried to save their lives, and the government said no. And in that document, he references the general public. And he says he's publishing this thing because he's convinced that the public is becoming more aware at every turn. And once they understand what's happening, they wouldn't tolerate it. And now we are the people of this period. But the same thing is playing out. There's more increased awareness, and thank heaven for those people who are speaking out. But it's relatively silent. It doesn't get the attention that these children deserve. And every one of those kids is worth all of us stepping up and saying something.
Now, of course, it's been almost a month when the tribunal ordered compensation for this discrimination, $40,000 to each kid and parents and grandparents who got caught up in this system. We've just heard that the Liberal government is going to appeal it. I mean, what do you think of that?
I think that's another sign that they're not accepting responsibility for their own behavior. I remember when the decision came down, Seamus O'Regan, the Minister for Indian Affairs, sent out a press statement saying the child welfare system is broken, it needs to be fixed. What he missed in the decision is it's his department that's broken and needs to be fixed. And I couldn't imagine, Todd, if a decision came against any organization I was with that we were willfully and recklessly discriminating against little kids in ways that contribute to their deaths and separations from families, that I would, first of all, feel horrified about what we have done, and then second of all, and more importantly, move heaven and earth to make sure it doesn't happen again. And yet we haven't seen any of that from the government. What we've seen is, oh, well, look at all the good stuff that we've done in the past, and this kind of wishy-washy commitment to reconciliation. Well, that does nothing to save children's lives and keep families together. What they need to do is comply with the orders, stop fighting us in court, and do the right thing for these kids and their families.
Well, we'll see what happens if he forms a government or if the Liberals get back in. Once again, Ms. Blackstock, thank you for coming on Nation to Nation.
Thanks for having me.
After the break, a child welfare insider talks about how the system has been set up to fail these children. Welcome back. While the Canadian government funds 93% of on-reserve child welfare, the Ontario government creates the policy under which it operates. They've both created a system that has consistently failed children. Our next guest knows this all too well. Dr. Kim Snow is a professor at Ryerson University. She's an expert in children's mental health and children's services. Dr. Snow is also a child welfare insider who works to change the system. She joins me now from Toronto. Welcome to Nation to Nation, Dr. Snow.
Thanks for having me.
You've played a part in Death as Expected by looking at data APTN obtained. What were you examining and what did you find?
Well, we looked at the care patterns across a number of years. We looked from 2013 to 2018, and we drilled down to the average number of children in care, where they were placed, the types of placements they had, as well as the financial package with which they were provided. And we found quite a bit of inequity compared to that which we would see in the South.
You also found that 3 Indigenous agencies in Northern Ontario were underfunded by approximately $400 million by the federal government. How did you come up with that figure?
Well, we looked at the allocation funding for all the children's aid societies across the province, and when we compared that with the number of young people served, we found that those 3 agencies were in fact underfunded by at least $400 million, and that would be only to get them up to equitably underfunded as everyone else is. There has been a year-over-year underfunding in the Ontario child welfare budget, and it's most pronounced in these 3 agencies.
APTN found most of the 102 deaths were in this area that these 3 agencies operate in. Did that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me, because when you add up the inequitable funding and the structural inequity that you see up there, so you know, housing, poor quality housing, the cost of food alone, the poverty that's seen, these are the structural inequities that lead to child welfare involvement. And then when you look at the data of the types of wards, we see that about 42% of the Crown wards in the province are cared for by these 3 agencies. So with less money, less services, and less infrastructure for children, we're going to see poor results. And sadly, in child welfare, sometimes these results are deadly, as we have seen.
You've investigated these Indigenous agencies. In your opinion, would you say they've been set up to fail?
The need is enormous. The structural inequity in the region is enormous. I don't know if it was intentionally set up to fail, but they are inevitably going to fail when there is such inadequate basic infrastructure. You can't do child welfare when you don't have clean drinking water or you know, adequate food or respite care. So when it's underfunded compared to everyone else, yet you need to fly from community to community, you often need to provide subsidy for food or shelter. These costs are much higher. So how could they meet the standards that are seen down south with so much more money, with so fewer young people in their care?
Of course, the federal government passed child welfare reform legislation before the House got up for its summer recess. What do you think of that legislation? Is this going to help things at all?
I'm not sure it will, and my worry really is always the safeguards for children in care. And so my focus is on the children, and no matter what policy or what nation is running a child welfare service, we need to have safety in the placements. So we need to know that young babies have safe sleeping. We need to know that young children, their rights and voices being heard. We need to know that there's adequate care, that there are safeguards and oversights to ensure that young people are protected in the care system.
Of course, we're in the middle of an election campaign. Have you heard anything from any of the major parties that would lead you to believe that things will change?
I've not heard enough, and in fact, I'm quite disappointed with what I've heard. We have heard from Death as Expected that babies are dying from unsafe conditions in foster care. This should be a front page news story that is dominating the news or the election cycle, and I simply don't see it. We should be, I think Cindy Blackstock said we should be moving, taking all actions to address this. She's right. It's reckless and it's dangerous to not address this urgent situation.
As you said, it hasn't been much of an election issue. What has come up is that the federal government, of course, as you know, is fighting First Nations children receiving compensation through their order that came out about a month ago. And of course, the federal government recently announced it's going to appeal that. What do you think about that?
I think it's shameful. We have known, Cindy Blackstock has raised for over a decade that the underfunding has put kids at risk. We've demonstrated that children are dying. We can no longer continue to allow children to die simply because they have structural inequity in the North. Young people in the North deserve the same standards of care as those who are down South. And because they are in care, we have a higher standard of, a higher duty of care to them. And so we're obligated under international law to do much better. And by appealing this decision, we're saying that we do not value those lives, and we need to rethink this. I do not believe Canadians want this decision to be appealed. We do not want to have children continue to die in care.
Well, Dr. Snow, I want to thank you for taking this time to talk to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
After another break, Nation to Nation producer Kenneth Jackson speaks to two youths who spent their whole lives in care. Welcome back. As you've already heard, Canada continues to fight First Nations children about how much money each should get for being in care. We spoke to two longtime Crown wards who live here in Ottawa, and they have something to say to Canada. Both of them must remain anonymous because they're still in care. Nation to Nation producer Kenneth Jackson first spoke to a 19-year-old Ojibwe woman.
What do you think when you see, after everything you've been through, from being in care in your group homes, seeing your friends die, and go through the struggles you've gone through, to see someone like Justin Trudeau and the Canadian government fighting, giving you $40,000?
I find it selfish, honestly, you know? It's not like they get paid so much money. They never live their life, nothing. They can get whatever they want within a snap of a finger. But it's so hard to give kids who were abused physically and mentally, sexually or whatever way.
Something you told me when you were, I believe you were 9, in a foster home, and to keep the one older boy out, you would nail a chair down to hold up against the door. What was it like for you in care when it comes to the abuse you suffered?
You wonder why a lot of kids run away. There is reasons. We don't do it because we're bored. We are angry at them. Well, maybe some do. Like I'm not sure. But I know my main reason was I ran away because I didn't want to deal with that. You know, it's not okay. It really wasn't okay. Like it was horrible. It was traumatizing. I was scared. I was a child. Like, how does a child even know this stuff? I don't know, but I know I had to grow up really, really early. I started watching kids at 7. Like, come on. Like, you know, I had to do everything my own, and I'm used to it, still am. But it hurts. It really does hurt, because I'm used to being the parent at a young age. I used to parent my siblings at a very young age, and I had no parents. My dad was in jail my whole life. My mom's a junkie and an alcoholic. I had me and my siblings. And now that I'm far away, I miss them every day. Don't know if the youngest ones remember me. I know the two oldest ones do. But it's just, it hurts every day. And I wish I can go back home. But there is a reason why I just left. You know, all the crap, the really worst crap that happened to me was back home, back in that area. I'm not saying my reserve, but just generally that area.
The
up
Kenora
north.
area?
Kenora, Winnipeg, Thunder Bay,
Yeah.
north area, yeah.
Jackson also spoke to a 20-year-old Ojibwe man.
I know you probably don't have that money in your pocket, and maybe 40 grand doesn't change a whole hell of a lot for you, but what do you think about Canadian government saying, after everything you've been through, the very last minute going, no, I don't want to give you 40 grand?
Well, and simply put, it's bullcrap, because if you're saying that someone who's been through a lifetime of rape, physical abuse, and just constant beatings, that they don't deserve 40 grand, it's ridiculous.
We're going to go through a little bit of your time in care. You were born into it. Tell us how you were born into care.
Well, as far as I can remember, it was mostly because my mother had mental health issues, and I hadn't known until after I was 10 that she had mental health issues, and she passed away when I was 5, so I never really got to know her, and I never knew how to feel about it, so never talked about it, and most of the time when I was in school and stuff, it just never worked out. I was kicked out of classes and stuff because no one knew how to talk to me or handle me in general. And I made it a lot harder on people just because I didn't trust anyone. And it made it a lot harder to trust people since a lot of the stuff that happened to me when I was a child just messed me up. Like, when I was 6, a year after my mom had passed away, I was sexually assaulted for at least 3 to 4 months. And then I moved from that place to Kenora. And then after that, it just started going worse. And after that, I ended up setting my place on fire and having to move again and again, repeatedly, just because I didn't like the situation that I was in anymore. And I didn't trust anyone, so I didn't want to stay. And I just kept moving, finding reasons to move. And I never learned to trust anyone the way that I trust people now, so.
It brought you to Ottawa too, right? You were sent to Ottawa?
Yeah, only because the last group home that I was in had charged me, and I don't know if it was the right thing to do, because at the time I was dealing with my sister's death, and I don't know if they knew that it would just make it worse, just keeping me under worse supervision all the time.
You can catch both of those interviews in full online tomorrow on aptnnews.ca. Well, that's our show for this week, and if you missed any part of it, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. Next week, we go full on into election mode. We'll be just days away from the vote, and we'll ask whether Justin Trudeau deserves 4 more years, or should it be someone else? I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.